Hey guys, it's Wingfors here. You know they say that every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, God kills a Kirin? Well, this is Foreign's channel. And every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, Foreign kills a Seagull.
Okay, this is episode number 9 of Watch the Overture. And number 9, Yiska, apparently in like Hebrew numerology, because obviously Kabbalah, they relate like numbers to... Apparently 9 is the number of finality or judgment, where you can sum up and judge a person and his works. Now, as I learned a long time ago, like that old quote, I think it's like a Camus quote, you know, like, don't wait for the final judgment. It comes every day. But enough about my Twitter, right? So anyway, what we're actually going to judge here and talk about is the Overwatch League and its format. So one of the interesting things about this particular topic is most leagues, especially ones that have like developer control, so it's not as open to like just, you know, someone from the public suggesting something and then implementing it tomorrow, is most leagues start with very simplistic formats. So I'm thinking like when the LCS came out, you know, it was very, very simplistic. It was just a bunch of best of ones. You played everyone twice, I think. And then the playoffs were like just best of threes until you got to the final. And they had a very simplistic playoff bracket that wasn't very like advanced or nuanced at all. And what happened was over the years, they sort of like added levels of complexity and tweaked things and made some parts better. I mean, some things in the end, they actually reverted and made not as good, like went back to best of ones. But okay, they tweaked the format over the years. The reason why I actually, even though I don't agree with the way they've structured the LCS, the reason why I could vaguely understand that approach is because obviously the people who designed it actually weren't experts about esports and didn't seem to have done a lot of research in esports formats. So they started with a simplistic, not very good format, and over time, in theory, changed it based on like seeing other formats, tweaking things. Now, the reason the Overwatch League format is confusing to me is because it's actually a fairly complex format. And it seems to have had all these decisions made along the way. But first of all, I've actually never been able to find online any kind of explanation for what even the vision was of the format or why they made the format moves. And then also, the reason why it's even more confusing is, since there's no explanation, I don't know if they assume that people understand the way the format works, because it's got no parallel, as far as I can tell, to any traditional sport. So, Monty, do you have any, has there ever been a reason given to you as what the logic of like the stages and then the stage playoffs, like not really counting to anything, but being something and then leading into the fight? Was there any like rationale or big picture view of it?
Well, I mean, if you remember, I've made content about formats in the past where I don't like the fact that the stage playoffs are effectively meaningless, especially the stage 4 ones, because obviously nobody's going to reveal anything right before the actual playoffs for just money. And I was saying you should do a circuit point system like you have in League of Legends, where if you win a stage, then you get a certain amount of circuit points or playoff points that qualify you for the playoffs. That in itself might be too complex of a structure. Because I think there are other ways to accomplish the same goal with a running sort of match total. If at the end of the season you have like a wild card where like you have a few playoff slots where like 6 teams play for them, so you have like a little mini tournament between those 6 teams, so you can go into the playoffs in the end. As far as the stages are concerned, I think a lot of this is looking towards the future, where you have these like sort of home and away systems, and that's what the divisions are for, because the divisions aren't really doing anything right now. In fact, they're relatively meaningless. As there are more teams added, however, those divisions are going to become increasingly meaningful, and because you'll probably play more games against your division opponents and then fewer games against teams outside of your division. So sort of like the NFL, where you play a double round robin within your division, and then you play sort of like a preset rotating group of teams over the years. So I would anticipate that that's something that's going to happen. Whether it's going to happen next year or not, I do know, but I can't say. Okay. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of weird stuff in here that I have information, but I can't share it with you, unfortunately.
So this is actually tied to the like longer term plans of the geolocation element, where people will actually be playing like a game in Korea, a game in China, wherever they're based.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. And I think that in terms of the number of games and the way it was done, because it was sort of weird, right? So we had 40 games, but that's not even enough time for each team to play 4 games against every opponent, because you would have to play 44 games to play every opponent 4 times, which I also think is too much, personally. I think like I don't need to see another, I don't need to see 4 games of Shanghai Dragons versus Florida Mayhem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it really was, I think, too much because you got too many repetitive matchups. Some of them ended up being fun, like London versus Houston, which was consistently in Houston's favor. So you always got like that chance of the upset. But a lot of them were just sort of boring. So I'd rather see fewer games. But we had 40 games, but that meant that you played every game in your every team in your division 4 times, and then you only played 3 times against some of the teams in the opposite division. Was what it sort of came down to. But as you add more teams, I assume the idea behind the divisions will be you play more games against teams in your division, fewer games against teams outside of your division.
Okay. Yiska, what were your thoughts on the Overwatch League format?
Well, generally, I think there were, like, across the season, a couple of issues popped up, generally. Like, we could say, for instance, player fatigue was one thing. Like, patch timing certainly was an issue. Sometimes also these back-to-back matches where some teams had to play within 16 hours, 2 matches, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Just by dragging out that, it would certainly fix some issues as well. It also, in some cases, was actually a trap game in there as well, where you were playing I think, for instance, Dallas had this, where they were playing a medium-tier opponent that they could have beaten, and then a low tier, and then they were always, in danger of losing the easy one because they obviously want to get the game of the median team. So that also, I think, if people care, Beezy actually had an article on this where he basically looked at how many trap games people had and how many back-to-back games and everything like that, right?
Right, what about this then? Let's take some of those points and separate them out. So what about this one? So Monty, one of the first points he made there is something which has been a clear concern, and in every game which has regular patching, so League of Legends is another good example, is always going to be a concern, which is how much patching goes on during the tournament. Now, that's already a problem in the LCS, and the LCS is split up into 2 splits, because obviously if you get the patch comes in a week before the playoffs, it can alter who's going to do well in the playoffs, But the thing with the Overwatch League is it's spread out for so long. I mean, how many weeks total was it?
It's like 6-7 months.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there's going to be many patches over that period of time. That's obviously an area where the format being so long, instead of being distinct separate tournament, like if each stage was its own tournament, would be a little bit different, But since technically it's supposed to be a league and it's just cumulative games, like if you won the first 40 games, you were in the playoffs no matter what, there's nothing could have happened. So what do you think in that sense of like how that aspect of the format with the patching?
I think it's inevitable. What I think needs to happen is that we have to have the patch timings built around the Overwatch League system. So it should be built around the stages, so we don't have like surprise patches, or there's a patch that gets released and doesn't have time to get altered. And also it just keeps people interested because it's on the same patch that they're playing on. Obviously, that's not going to be perfect. You'll probably have like a week here, a week there, because you can't just patch and then immediately patch the tournament client because you don't know what bugs are in there. There could be really disastrous stuff. So if it was coming out like a week or 2 before the end of the stage, and then they had a couple weeks to work on the bugs and make sure everything was stable, and then that way by the time the stage ended, then you would have the ability to, the pro players would have the ability to go onto the ladder, test it during the stage break, make sure the teams were practiced on the new patch, and then get into it for the next stage. I think mostly, though, the problem was that Blizzard hasn't been very good about not over buffing or over nerfing things. So I think mostly the patch problem is on their end, because I think they're making too large of adjustments. Like, we shouldn't end up with the Sombra that was in Contenders this year. We shouldn't end up with Stage 1 Mercy. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So I think Blizzard as a company is still learning how to balance this game, and they have made some pretty large changes that have affected the professional level. But I wasn't actually too upset. We never got the Sombra in Overwatch League because they never patched it in before they nerfed it, which was fine. And then by the time we were in playoffs, I didn't think the playoff patch was that big of a deal. It wasn't that major compared to a lot of their other stuff. So I didn't think it was the worst thing in the world towards the end. And I think they're going to get better about making more subtle adjustments to the game.
The question to me as an outsider is if it's actually desirable for Blizzard to make subtle adjustments, because obviously what we're fighting here, and I know that some people are so naive about the intentions of such changes, is of course, yes, you want to make the game better because game obviously isn't perfect at this point, but it's also definitely a creator of novelty, right? So I think in some ways that very much was probably intended, probably not to the extent, especially Mercy Stage 1 was simply ridiculous, especially if you look at it in hindsight, how people would have probably gone off on that now with the knowledge that the Mercy players have now. But it seems that obviously we need to weight these two interests. On the one hand, we want to have people engaged also in the competitive side of Overwatch themselves, so to play, and sadly, we are all like very bored very easily and very quickly, right? So I think certainly there has to be some sort of balance, and probably like a sweet spot where it's enough novelty created, also possibly through Overwatch meta switching just by pro players or pro teams discovering new stuff, and that therefore
or by new heroes being released, like what we saw with Brigitte, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, that was a huge change, especially in the pro meta. But yeah, like these two forces and so on, it need to be balanced. And I thought it was a little bit, for my taste, a little bit too hard on the side of novelty, and that could have just been, well, inexperience in overbuffing certain heroes.
Okay. So one thing about the stage aspect that I found really confusing is the way that the playoffs of the stage were treated almost as some kind of like exhibition tournament, because they didn't obviously have any points that contributed towards the overall season standings. It was still just a league, and then it went into a playoffs. But it's like even if you excluded having literal points that would count to something, they weren't even really set up as though they were a big deal either. They were just like, you know, they took place at the end of the week. They just took place. There's the games. Sometimes you could play 2 games in one day. What do you think about that, Monty? Like, what was the rationale behind that, or what do you think they were trying to accomplish with those playoffs for the stages?
I guess they just wanted to have some sort of like hype moment, but the problem is that because it was only for money, like it wasn't actually. I mean, for me at least, it wasn't actually ending up being that hyped. I think it's much more interesting to have you crown a champion and have them get something out of it, even just something like a trophy. But like I said, playoff points would be great. That scale, so like stage 4 is worth more playoff points than stage 1 because it's closer to the meta you're going to be playing. I think there are, from talking to people, there are other ways you can do that as well without having the confusing sort of secondary playoff point system, which is that even if you have running totals of the league, you can have like running match totals. You know, if you have I mentioned this earlier, but if you have like 2 remaining slots and you take, you know, the next 4 or 8 teams or 6 teams and put them in a bracket and then have them play for those last 2 playoff spots, that gets maybe a team that would have been 4 slots too low to get into playoffs, able with a hot streak at the end in that meta, able to make it. So that's a little bit more, I think, comprehensible to the lay person rather than the secondary system that I like stacked on top of it. But as for the stage playoffs, I don't really know. It's like I would rather have not done that. I would rather have self-contained stages and then move on with the playoffs being some sort of qualification process based on your placement in each of the 4 like mini tournaments. Then just have it be for money.
Like, I'll give you an example.
The teams took it pretty seriously, but also having them on the same day as the end was bad. So then they moved them to like, you know, if you're going to do stage playoffs, what I have to say is like, do them right. Move them to another weekend where that's all that's happening so that the teams can properly prepare for them and we really get to see good games.
Like, I'll give you a great example of the knock-on effect that that kind of a setup format can have on like the wider esports implications. So I'm involved with a couple of the different like esports awards type things that are going on. And part of being involved in that process is you inevitably have to explain to some other people who aren't as deep into the in this case, Overwatch or League of Legends or whatever. Maybe they come from Call of Duty or CS. When you're doing like one of the general categories, like Player of the Year, Team of the Year, you have to explain to these people, based on your expertise, you know, the game that they don't follow. And what I found when I came to explain to people from these other games, by the way, notably, the other games tended to be open circuit games, Dota, Call of Duty, CSGO, people from the open circuit, because they have that as their like premise and parameters of how the scene's built, they can totally explain to me very quickly why the best Call of Duty team is this team, or why this other team that was a Call of Duty team, okay, they didn't win the big world championship, but here's why they are still really good. You know, they won 2 other tournaments, they had 4 top 4s. As soon as they're even saying these basic things to me, I get it instantly. But when I was trying to explain to people, for example, like who the best League of Legends team of the year was, it was already getting really difficult because I was having to say like, well, okay, so Royal Never Give Up is the team that won the big international tournament in League of Legends, but that's actually the only tournament they played against any of the other teams for the Korean teams, for example. And so the problem is their league is like the Chinese league, which hasn't usually been considered as good as the Korean league. So it's actually hard for me to explain to you if the Chinese team is better than, for example, the best Korean team who might yet win. You know, it was getting really complicated, and it got even worse for Overwatch, because in Overwatch, they actually had in a lot of these award ceremonies, the top 2 teams that they put forward for Overwatch were just the 2 finalists of the season. And so I was having to explain to people, this is actually flawed, you know, like it doesn't actually logically make sense that you could even say Fusion is a contender for the best team of the year, whereas, for example, NYXL almost inarguably is, but that's if you know outside of the format, the context. If you look at the format and you really don't count the playoffs of the stages as meaning anything, well then, yeah, they had the best record, but they blew it. Well, you know what? There's plenty of teams in NFL history who've had like 14-2 record, but didn't win the Super Bowl, didn't even get to the conference final. So nobody would ever list that team as best team of all time. You know, they couldn't be. So I think that actually the format is a little bit of a problem in the casual sense in that respect, because I'm sure a lot of people don't understand that because the London Spitfire actually had so many bad splits towards the end, stages rather. They
literally had a losing record in their last 2 stages.
They probably actually, on average, even though they won the playoffs, NYXL probably still should be the best team of the year in Overwatch, if you know what I mean. Like, I know it's touch and go because they didn't win, but just the comprehensive excellence day to day, for me, yeah, it does outperform the other one, but the format wouldn't tell you as much, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know a way to get around that, because Americans are very used to these kind of formats, so it's not hard to explain it to Americans. But it is, I think, harder to explain it to people who are outside of America and the American sports system.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, by the way, just as context, this isn't a problem, yes, unique just to Overwatch. Like, for example, I mean, I obviously gave you the great example there of like the NFL, the NBA. It is unfortunately the case that if an underdog wins the playoffs of one of these tournaments, someone's going to look back in a history book and go, oh, wow, the Giants were the best team of 2007. It's like, definitely not, under no circumstances. But unfortunately, I get why you'd get that message, you know, sadly.
Yeah, especially since the NFL is like a best of 1, too. It's just one game, because it's not physically feasible to play more games than that because of the violence of the sport. That'd be like having like a best of 3 in boxing, you know, it's just a terrible idea.
Yeah. I think generally I mean, Blizzard as well, but as a community as a whole, I think we could do a lot in order to add meaning to these different stages as well. For instance, we could have certain, I don't know, milestones when someone, for instance, wins or qualifies for different stage playoffs, like the NYXL did this season, right? Just something that the mind can attach to, and therefore assign meaning and go like, oh, can they do it? Like, can they get to the 4th playoffs or what? Something, you know, something that has also like a history in the league. Obviously, in the first season, we can't really expect.
Well, I mean, we referred to this on actually the last episode, or was it 2 episodes ago? If you remember, though, I think it was the one about the atrophy of meaning, where I brought up that example of when, like, Korean StarCraft, they had those badges when you won the league. And then the whole point was, like, you know, obviously not many people had ever won one of these leagues. So even having 2 badges on your uniform meant that, like, you had, like, sick bragging rights, basically. Are you still there, Monty?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, sorry, I thought your camera froze for a second. Right, so like that like ties into that concept, because what's good about that is, like you're saying there, Yiska, you don't actually have to even change the format. Like the stage playoff could still mean nothing, but you know what? It means nothing in terms of the league standings. But if I'm the NYXL and I have like two of those things saying I won a stage, that looks pretty sick in and of itself.
Yeah,
that's on my uniform.
Yeah, I mean, it's all a cycle of intention, or rather what drives players. So the problem is, like, there's two ways you could go about it. You could tell the players it's much more meaningful if you feel and express that it's more meaningful in interviews, in actually like feeling it in the moment, and therefore like having certain expressions on stream. Also, those would have to be shown on the broadcast, but something that the audience realizes by, okay, this is actually, like, they are fighting for their lives practically. This is a simulation of war right here. As it was, I think, to me, the most hyped stage playoffs were London against NYXL in this first season, where people still didn't realize that, or didn't have like a context what these stage playoffs actually mean in the system, where there was the most pressure. I remember there was a piece in, or a line in the Pine piece that we had before the Overwatch League finals, where he said after he lost that final, he was like, why continue on living, right? So
I'm obviously cultural translation there, you know, like it doesn't mean that literally, you know, it's just a very emphatic statement. But
not even on living. I think it was something like, why continue on existing, right?
Okay, so, even better. That's even worse than living. It just existence itself. Okay, right?
Isn't that hilarious that they then went on to, you know, sandbag down, and they basically went from expectations of stage 1 to like, I guess we can drive to the venue today to play our games. Yeah, there was some importance lost, and obviously some of it is systematic, but also I think a lot of it can be done. And I think, for instance, Talent did a great job in that regard, where you always dressed up. I noticed, for instance, in terms of the stage playoff finals, which was a clear like contrast to the normal games. We were dressed more casually, and the tone of the broadcast was much different. If everyone in the
but like I also advocated for, let's not call them, like, stage 1 is so boring. I said let's call it, like, let's have them be cups, you know, where there's a cup, there's a trophy, there's an Omnic Cup that is the first stage, and there's the Talon Cup. So there's actually like a graphical theme around the entire stage. You actually know, it's like Mario Kart, right? You have a bunch of races and like the Star Cup or whatever. Sure. And so you have a different trophy for each phase of the season that the team is lifting up at the end. So it creates hype. Like they're the current like Omnic Cup champions. They were the Omnic Cup champions last year, whatever you want to call it, theme it with the game. So I think that that's a much better way to deliver hype, even if you're not doing any kind of meaningful, impactful overall playoff results based on the stage playoffs. But at least it creates hype, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean,
there's actually like another thing as well about the way you order the playoffs. Like, this is something from my experience in other games. Like, Counter-Strike's obviously the best example, because Counter-Strike really is one of the only games where, I'm not exaggerating, someone like me making sometimes just a tweet or a video or an article can actually change the format of a tournament. Because what happens is, because Counter-Strike is an open circuit, and in theory the tournament organizers compete against each other, if they really think, for example, say I put out a video like, you know, double elimination is the best format or something, if it seemed like the groundswelling of like Reddit and Twitter was like, people were like, yeah, I agree, always wanted to see double elimination, there's actually a decent chance that one of the tournament organizers will think to themselves, this is a way to get ahead, you know, let's run a tournament in that, let's see how it goes. And if it works out well, obviously then they get the plaudits for doing so. And so they're actually incentivized to change formats based on what, like, in theory, the experts or the community figures think. Whereas actually I've noticed one of the problems when it comes to convincing people of a new format or to try a new format is actually exactly that mechanism, which is that what people complain about is what will seem the most important to the tournament organizers. So, for example, in CSGO, we actually had a problem where, for me, it was making the tournament suck. That when we used to use the GSL format, where you'd have like the 4 teams in a group and it's a little double elim within the group, not all the games were best of 3 at the time because we didn't have tournaments that were long enough to do that many games. So they could only usually make 2 games best of 3s, right? So what they would do is they would make the deciding game to see who came second out of the group double elim, best of 3, and they would make the last place game best of 3. Now you might think, why would you put the last place game best of 3? That's going to be the worst game of the group. That's exactly why, because the only time people were vocal, fans or players, was when a team went out last place, and if it was 2 best of 1s they'd played and lost, they'd go, that's unfair, I only played 2 best of 1s and I'm out of the tournament. And what's mad about that is, even though in that isolated scenario, I totally agree with them, you know, I wouldn't want to go out of the tournament after playing 2 best of 1s, but what I never understood about the principle is, I said this to tournament organizers, yeah, but that's not what you're actually deciding when you decide where to put the best of 3. You're deciding which game should be a best of 3. So I told them the obvious choices. It should be the winner's match should be the best of 3, so that you can only get out of the group by winning a best of 3 somewhere, and you never can like go the other way. You can never win 2 best of 1s and get straight out of the group and fluke it, you know, and not actually be that good. And the point that they didn't understand, because obviously no one's going to be vocal about that, like, wow, someone got out, like, it's not as big a complaint because the team made it out of the group. It's like a positive thing happened to them. And the point I'm making here is, whenever you make any format choice on specific like details like that, it's a zero-sum game. You're always favouring or disfavouring someone. So if you make your choices to help the worst teams in the league and make it seem fair for them, you're actually going to make it like less competitive for the top teams, or you're going to make it not as like harsh, therefore it's not going to celebrate the players who are the best, etc. It's like, there's a great Ayn Rand quote, right, where I saw someone ask her once in an interview. They once said, like, someone from the crowd was like, why do you hate poor people? And she was like, I don't hate poor people, actually. I just don't think that they're the best thing ever, and all of society should be tailored to suit them. And it's actually a brilliant point, because it's not that you shouldn't do anything for poor people. It's that you wouldn't, like, destroy all the rest of the meritocracy of society just to benefit poor people, would you? Not least because we all aspire to not be poor one day. So we want the best teams to succeed. So one of the things as well about the format of the Overwatch League, in line with this, that I found a bit weird, was the part where you make the stages cumulative. Because as you're saying, Monty, if it was just a league, let's say there was no stages and it really did just start on day 1, it's like an NFL season. Day 1 to the last day of the season, that's the league. There's way too many games, right? Like that's going to burn people out playing 44 games, especially when, as we say, every one of them in theory counts. I mean, I know once you've locked up a spot, in theory it doesn't, but up until that point, it does. Like, even if you're leading the league for the first 2 stages, you still haven't locked a spot up technically, and you still haven't locked up the first seed, and so like it's going to be hard to avoid things like burnout if you have a format like that. Maybe even impossible, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I don't know, it has that other problem, which is like, when you're talking about, yes, okay, well, after 2 stages, you definitely haven't necessarily locked up a playoff slot. But at the same time, the closer you get to the end, the less exciting things get, which is why I really think that we need some sort of like comeback mechanic. Yes. Which is why I was advocating for weighted playoff points towards stage 4, where, you know, you just get more playoff points if you do well in stage 4 rather than stage 1. But again, the other way to solve this is to have a play-in for the last, you know, X number of playoff seeds, where you pull in some of the, you know, you have the 2 teams at the top automatically get in, like you have, or the top like 6 teams, because now with more teams this year, I imagine we'll move to an 18 bracket instead of having this weird 16 playoffs. So what if, in that theoretical world, if we're going to add, you know, half a dozen new teams to the league, then we can have an 8-team playoff bracket, which means there aren't any buys, which suck, I think, objectively. Yes. Makes it a lot cleaner. So you have like, okay, you have 6 teams that are automatically getting in based on their record, so the top 6 teams. And then what happens if the next 6 teams, so seeds 7 through 12, all of a sudden have to play a different bracket to get to the last 2 slots to get into the playoff bracket. So you have like a week where you just sort of jam like a mini tournament in, get those teams to play it out. That way, even the team who places 12th has a shot of getting into the playoffs. And that's a comeback mechanic, because that team could have been doing very well, say, in stage 3 and 4, and barely sort of squeaked into that position. And then they have at least a chance to beat out the 7th, 8th seeds for that last slot. which I think would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about European leagues and how they function, there's so many different types of reasons why you would care about the very last few couple of games. So you have relegation, obviously that's not part of it, but definitely, qualifying for Europe League or qualifying for the Champions League and whatever, basically everyone but the very mid teams, so possibly below 30% of the teams, have nothing to fight for in the last couple of games. Now, this time around, I mean, we sort of artificially had this even more than we probably should usually have, with Shanghai trying to get that one win. Nobody will care if such an anomaly happens at the lowest type of teams, right? If everyone has 5 wins, and then if these teams play against each other, that hype is gone as well.
Well, the best example is obviously Mayhem, right? Because here's the thing, you're right, Shanghai had the novelty of will they ever win a game. Mayhem had won a few games, and so as a result, they'd won just enough no one gave a fuck about their games.
Yes, exactly.
They had no reason to watch them win, because they couldn't make the playoffs. They were objectively one of the worst, but they weren't the absolute worst. Therefore, why did they exist? If anything, they should all have been doing that pine tweet after every game. Or whatever it was, blog comment or something. No, by the way, what you said there, Yiska, if I'll unpack that a little bit for Americans, because that is something I feel is lost on Americans who only watch their sport, which is, right, so every time when you hear about a traditional franchised American league where you can't be relegated, when they bring up relegation, you only ever hear it brought up basically as kind of a political talking point by the owners to explain, this is bad for the league, you can get relegated, you can lose your investment. What they actually never communicate is that it basically exists as a kind of negative playoff race. So in the English Premier League, for example, I don't know how many teams there are now. Off the top of my head, I'd guess 20, 22, something like that, right? Say there's 20 teams in the English Premier League for football, soccer, right? So yes, obviously, we have no playoffs in the Premier League. It's just a league, so ignore that part. But you're trying to win the league if you're the top, say, 3 or 4 teams, most likely. Usually it's 3 or 4 have a chance to win, because by the time you get down to the end of the games, you played 36 games or something. At that point in time, you're not going to be able to win if you're the 5th place team. So those top teams, their whole mission is, can we beat out these teams? Can we win the league? As you're saying, Yiska, they then added a secondary element, which is very clever, which is, so the top teams not only can win the league, but in doing so, they qualify for the UEFA Champions League, for example. Then the next few spots, so let's say, depending on which league you're in, positions 3 to 5, they would have a secondary European Cup you could qualify for, which was I think the winner of that then gets in the Champions League the next season. So it was it was almost kind of like a wild card tournament for teams in the region. And then at the bottom of the league, relegations, like I say, basically operate as a negative playoffs, because you don't want to be in consideration for that. So you're battling to stay out of that. And then what they often did in the Premier League, for example, was they would make it even more exciting by having one team was guaranteed relegated. Whoever finishes bottom goes down no matter what. But they would make it so that the bottom 2 or 3 would then actually play a playoff against the 2nd and 3rd team from the division below. So the bottom team was auto-relegated, the top team in the division below was auto-promoted, and then the others, there was basically a playoff from the league below against the bottom teams from the one above. So there was always even a reason that these teams had to keep playing to the very end. And as you're saying, Yiska, basically the only teams that didn't get affected were, let's say, in a league of 20, it would be, teams who were in 13th to 15th or 16th, they're the ones who were just out of contention to get relegated. They can't really, unless they did some insane run over the last half, make it to the playoffs. And so actually, they're the people that it's not that big a deal if their games don't matter, because they're still half decent. They're still all right teams, so they're still going to have okay games. And it doesn't matter, actually, that they can't get relegated and they can't win the league. All the rest of the league, you found a reason for them all to keep competing. Because obviously one of the big problems in a franchise league, this is something that's always going to be brought up, is the last thing you ever want is a team who, whichever way, is incentivized not to play anymore. And especially, I mean, obviously this wouldn't generally happen, but you don't want anyone to throw a game. Because, for example, if I play you in the beginning of the season and there's everything to play for, and it's a really hard fought one, but then you just basically roll over at the end of this stage when you're playing my rival for a playoff spot, that's kind of fucked for me. I'm going to be like, what the hell? Why didn't you try? But objectively, I know why you didn't try. There was nothing left for you to, as an impetus to drive you forward. So I don't really know how you're going to solve that in any kind of a franchise model in the North American sports system. Like, I don't really know what the...
Well, what's even worse is in the North American system is not only that, like you have the problem of the sort of inverse playoffs, which makes it more exciting in the European system and not in the American system, but you honestly, because of drafting, have reasons to completely tank your team and like intentionally lose. Yeah. So it gets even worse, honestly. Obviously, we're not going to have any kind of draft that requires a players association. So I don't think that Overwatch League will be having that until the players actually form some sort of collective bargaining agreement. But it's possible in the future that we might, in which case, yeah, if there's a particularly attractive prospect who is going to be turning 18 for the next season of Overwatch, it's not inconceivable that a team would throw. I mean, very famously, like, you know, the last time in the NFL this happened, because at least in some sports like the NBA, because of what the 76ers were doing, you didn't necessarily get the top slot in the draft.
They just gave you slightly more of a chance of getting it.
Yeah, it gave you like slightly better odds of getting the top slot in the draft by being the worst team, because teams were abusing that.
Yes.
But famously, of course, the suck for luck Indianapolis Colts, who their fans had their own motto, the suck for Andrew Luck, right? So they wanted this #1 pick, and if you are the worst team in the NFL, you get the #1 pick. That's just how it works. So you could intentionally be the worst team at a certain point in time.
You know, I've actually just realized when you've just said that, how you could fix all these American sports. But obviously, it would never be agreed upon, because unfortunately, it's a bit like this discussion we're having here. We're having a discussion from the point of view of people who like to watch high-level play and want a really great tournament design around that, which is not the business of how Overwatch League or sports run at all. They're all about things like, does it fit the viewer, and how are all the fans in the league going to view it? So obviously, because basically franchise leagues run kind of like a cartel, in that setting, the reason why the draft rules exist as they do in traditional sports makes sense to a degree. What they're basically saying is, since we're all in business together, if your team does really badly, we'll sort of give you the equivalent of, like, you know, a stimulus injection if you were a company, by saying you'll get a really good player in the draft and maybe that can revitalize your fortunes. So, you know, don't give up. The actual best way to run those sports would be to make the draft spots just above the bottom spots. So it's actually like, if you were like the last place team, you should try and compete to get 4 higher to get to a slightly better draft selection, you know. Now, in that scenario, it also wouldn't be unfair, because you're still not giving the draft spots to the good teams. You know, you're still like the bottom half, the ones who are getting it. But it would give them a reason to compete at the bottom, you know, and try and get like 3 extra wins in the season. And also, getting that player, if you're like the 13th best team, isn't going to make you the champion overnight, you know. It's still, you're still going to have to work for it. It would add some level of meritocracy to it.
I mean, the problem there, though, is that then the mid-table teams would play worse to sort of get a little bit down towards the bottom. So then you'd sort of ruin the middle of the table.
See, what you're bringing up here, Monty, is basically what you're bringing up is what I actually learned a long time ago about games, like any game that has a public matchmaking element to it. Because if you or I were making a matchmaking system, Monty, right, we would do things like, if 2 people don't join your team, it would instantly disband the game and we would get to queue up again. But we all know, as you learn in games like League of Legends, where rank means everything, every single loophole won't just be exploited, it will be exploited so much that what should have been a tiny downside will overwhelm the positive. So the positive of that is, I don't have to waste my time in a game that's not working. Now, I can tell you already, everyone who wants to boost would just both agree to leave the game until they got really favourable matchups against, like, the right, you know, exactly the right comp, or the team that they were playing had enough bad players on. They would abuse every aspect. So you're right, unfortunately, it would probably just shift the way you abuse your position in the table. So that now teams who are 13th throw the game.
Because it would be even worse in some ways, because if you were sort of an upper mid-table team and there was like a really good draft prospect, right? And you thought, well, if I can get this draft prospect next year, then I can maybe win the league or do very well in the playoffs, right? So you would tank intentionally towards the bottom middle of the table for 1 year, get that draft prospect, and then roar back with, you know, a brand new player.
This is why we can't have nice things. That's why that phrase exists.
I mean, the very fact is, though, like NYXL, to an extent, did abuse the systems of the league.
Of course they did.
Right? In sandbagging. And by the way, whoever is saying that they lost the season because of sandbagging, that's a major factor. I don't buy that for a second. Like, these patches were pretty rough on them in general. And then also just having... I'm not sure if that buy actually really Well, I don't want to get too
let's
deep
talk
into
about
it.
we'll talk about the buy thing in a second. But actually, by the way, the great way to phrase it, Yiska, goes like this. So think about it. There's a lot of fans out there actually agree with his point, Monty. They think that the whole sandbagging thing was like either it exists and they were stupid for doing it because, you know, in the end sort of karma caught up to them and they lost the playoffs, or they think it doesn't exist. Now, here's what's bizarre about that is that presumably they don't think the London Spitfire was sandbagging because obviously Spitfire almost didn't make it into the playoffs. So if you accept that the London Spitfire was really good when they won Overwatch Season 1, you must be able to reconcile the idea that they were pretty fucking bad in Stage 4, but they became good in the playoffs. Now just do the opposite. Imagine that the NYXL was really good, but became bad in the playoffs. There we go. I've solved the problem for you. No need for you to worry about that one, be tormented by it. We solved it. It's over. There's the mechanism for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that hard to believe. Now, the question about NYXL, now we know that they were not practicing as hard as they could have. And the question becomes, did that hurt them when you actually get into the playoff format? You know, there's not really a way to quantify that because you could say, okay, well, if they had practiced more, then they would have done better and they would have gotten, you know, more used to the patch. And that's all well and good, assuming that their players weren't burnt out. If their players were burnt out, then extra practice may not have been the best thing for them. And in fact, they could have been even worse because of increased burnout if they had played more. So it's really hard to know without being internal to the team what the proper thing to do was. But I think that if you lock up the #1 seed, given that basically every player in the league was burning out towards the end, that I definitely would have made the same decision. You know, just cut our scrims, give them some more time off, and we'll figure it out later for playoffs. They didn't figure it out, but who knows why that was. We can't, until we get more information from the team, which I think probably will come out over time. And the players can, I think, discuss it. The coaching staff can discuss it in retrospect, maybe in the off season when their people aren't going to get quite so mad about it. I think that we'll get more information and it'll become more clear as to what the team was going through internally.
Personally, I have to say I haven't quite divorced from your system that you suggested, like way back on the Oversight episode with the weighted stage playoffs. Now, one thing is, yes, it's probably, that's the one downside. It's hard to explain to to an audience, right? But at the same time, it feels like, I don't know, maybe it's my German scope, but this is in so many game show formats that these points ramp up. And it's like, depending on the system, how you do it, it's actually not that hard to explain. And it would also solve so many issues. So for instance, okay, so you start with stage 1, and it's actually not like the least meaningful stage. But you don't need that hype because you've just had 5 months or
exactly
of drought where everyone's hyped for that part anyway. You want to see the new teams, you want to see the new players, how do they interact, what did this team come up with? Stage 1 will never be not hype. You don't need systematic hype in that regard. Then stage 2 comes along, and there's a little bit more weight at it. But keep in mind, stage 2 is currently at least, the team where team performance fluctuates the hardest simply because the transfer window's open, right? So we're still, in stage 1 and stage 2, we still haven't seen at all the teams that we would eventually see in the playoffs. So why does that matter? This is like a ship of Theseus situation, right? So then it moves into stage 3. Transfer windows are closed. Preferably, that is the last major content patch just hit, and now we're starting off. Now it's also some viewer fatigue because there's obviously a lot of games already being played, but they are again incentivized because now we're cranking up the notch of the playoff points that you're gathering. And then in stage 4, keep in mind, whatever meta is happening in stage 4 is the most likely to be like playoffs, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to be stage 1. They're not going to revert any like major changes towards that again in order for that to reoccur. So the recency bias in that format, and by the way, the ultimate recency bias, by the way, is playoffs. So don't tell me you don't like that concept, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's very true.
So if we ramp this up, it naturally systematically creates hype towards the end of the season because, okay, let's quantify that. I don't want like probably the bottom third to have a chance still to qualify unless it's unusually close. But usually you have some, like the bottom third of the teams are probably so much worse, they shouldn't have a chance. For instance, Dallas, I think Dallas, someone with a run like Dallas, shouldn't be able to qualify for the playoffs, given the same performance. I think that would be too much of a boost. But maybe, for instance, let's say, had they done a little bit better in stage 3, had finished mid-table, and then actually won stage 4, I'm completely fine, because what it also does is we're creating the best playoff performances as well. We said it again, like the worst thing that could have objectively happened as a hype killer was, for some reason, Shanghai Dragons becoming the best team in stage 4. Just imagine that, right? Yeah. Obviously, that still shouldn't have qualified for them. But what if the reason was completely ruined because they were 0-20 after 2 stages? Then they bring in all the new players, right? They're suddenly starting to mesh, because you can't expect like a team to completely 180 without any practice. But they ramp up, and they actually, like, maybe in stage 3 they get like 60% win rate, and then they have a stage like Boston where they go 10-0. How is that not hype? How do you not want a team like this to be in the playoffs over a team that maybe almost made it in, like on the bottom end, right? Sure. I don't know.
But that's the system, like the system that I was talking about too, which is simpler with the play-ins. You could still have that like miracle run at the end, right? You just have to fight for it with the teams that are currently in the standings in like a separate bracket. So it does create some of the same thing, like the same hype that you're saying. I also prefer my way of doing it, which is, not really my way. It's modeled after what Riot did with their world championships with the circuit points, which I think is probably Riot's best system, honestly. I think you could do the same thing, but if you have the playoff points, I think it's better, but it is more confusing. And also you still get many of these same things, with a play-in at the end, because if Shanghai were to, have this miracle run and go like, finish their season like 18-22, like you're saying, then there would still be a possibility of them being 12th place or something in the league, because especially if they were winning that many games, they'd be knocking a bunch of other teams down the standings. Sure. And you'd have a chance for them maybe to fight through a bracket, have a playoff, and then get into the one of the final seeds.
So Yiska, to be fair, couldn't that hype killer already happened, mate? 3 people think that one of the MVP candidates didn't even play in the playoffs. We're not following the Overwatch League. Anyway, we'll just leave that as an Easter egg. We'll go into that one. Here's the thing, though. Since you brought it up earlier, actually, I do think it's worth discussing the aspect of getting a bye, because obviously this exists in other esports, in League of Legends, both in LCK, the Korean division. You actually get a bye on each playoff round depending on where you finish in the league. So first place waits in the finals, second place plays the second, third place game, and so on. In LCS, you get a bye into the semi-finals if you're a top 2 seed. Now, obviously, there is a basis for this in traditional sports, because famously in the NFL, you skip rounds based on how good you're, like if you win your division or whatever, and the wildcard game starts earlier on in the playoffs. But aside from that, every other sport I'm aware of just has a flat playoff structure. So even if you won literally all 82 games in the NBA, you still play in the first round. You just have the best possible number 1 seed, and you get to play number 8. So it's the same as if you were number 1 seed and you won 62 games. It doesn't actually change it. To be fair, even though it does exist in the NFL example, I actually think that's an example where people don't use the same logic you used before, Monty, about the best of 3s, which is, in the NFL, it is a good bonus to have, because playing one less game could be really meaningful when you consider the injuries. I mean, if everyone remembers that the Super Bowl where the Seahawks beat the Broncos, I noticed no one ever brings up that no one ever brings up, that Von Miller did not play in that game. He was injured.
Yeah.
No one brings that up. Well, that's the point. If you could have played one less game, that's a perfect example where it would help. Now, in a playoff setting like this, I think actually from my experiences in esports, I would always prefer the number 1 team plays in the first round of the playoffs. Like, first of all, it gives you extra games. So say they are really some dominant team, right? You get to see them tool the number 8 team. Brilliant. Who doesn't want to watch that? Sick. Think of all the games that we've seen where some dominant team, that's how they began their run to the championship. But more importantly, I actually do think from my own experience that when teams skip around, it actually takes away a bit of their performance, because the team they're playing has played a more recent official game than them. And it's almost like the ring rust concept from combat sports, Like, you might be the better team, but if they played last week and you just sat at home playing scrims, I don't really know that it translates the same way. So I personally would rather they got rid of buys and just made, like NYXL should have been playing a first round opponent like everyone. Same with Valiant,
Yeah, I totally agree with this. I think that the decision this season was not made because they wanted to do the buys, but because we only had 12 teams, and having 8 teams,
Sure.
so having 4 teams isn't a long playoffs. Having 8 teams is like 2/3 of the league. So even having half the teams in the league in the playoffs was, I think, like a little weird. So I think as we move forward, as we go on, you know, if we do have 6 teams joining this year, that's going to put us up to 18, which means that having 8 teams seems about the right number to have in the playoffs.
It's also, this just showcases to me, is like, in normal sports leagues, I'm sure sports fans are pretty used to some of the, at least star coaches making big excuses, right? Like, for instance, a Mourinho would go out and obviously give you the sickest excuse that like he could come up with, but everyone knows, because of the history, we sort of have empirical data to say, okay, this is either bullocks or it isn't, right? And a lot of this is solved by history. But the problem with Overwatch is that we currently have way too many legitimate excuses, being meta changes, being player burnout, in the sense that you know, you have to sort of source your weight your powers. Then also this buy, like these things, especially patches is probably the hardest factor in this. Like, they just devalue all the conversation about the player's strengths and everything. You know, and that is sort of something that really sucks out some of the meaning and allows. I'm not even sure if it really helps defeated teams to hide behind that. You know, the fans of them. So if it's possible, especially in the early stages of Overwatch, where we don't have the history to back this up, to empirical evidence, where everyone understands, okay, this is nonsense, right? That we have some, like, more objectivity than is probably needed after a while, simply to completely, you know, silence these excuses that teams could bring up, and indeed brought up in terms of Valiant, for instance, right? Coach Moon saying, yeah, it was very bad for us that we weren't able to play the first round. So
he actually did use that as an excuse. Okay.
I mean, it was brought up. I'm not sure if I would call it an excuse as much as an explanation, but
sure.
Yeah. And that is whack to me. Like, if that can be brought up, and at least, like, I can go like, okay, this is a 20% probability that he's right, or even going up as high as 50%. This already, like, devalues the series as a fan to me. And then obviously, also, if we're talking about player fatigue, right? One big factor definitely is, and when I talk to players, I always ask them, are there too many games? And they're like, no, like two games a week is actually not the problem. The problem is that we potentially have to prepare for 11 maps. So you have 2 best of 5s, and then the tiebreaker map you probably should also practice. So obviously there is some overlap, but not that much. Usually you play like maybe the same map twice per week.
This ties back into another aspect of the format then that we could discuss, which is that since they didn't go with a veto system, you potentially have to play every map throughout the season. And especially, we know some weeks you don't get the maps that you're as strong on. Now, in Counter-Strike, it's already pushing it that we have 7 maps you have to play, but at least someone has a ban. They can, like, if you really want to, some teams do pick to permanently ban 1 map, because that way it's like, right, well, there's 1 map out the pool, so there's 6 left. Okay, one of them, maybe people won't pick as much, so that's like kind of like a soft ban in itself. Right now I've got 5 to practice. Just trying to practice 5 is really tough, and I always make this point just for the fan who hasn't thought this through. You might think to yourself, what are you talking about? You're a professional gamer. You just have to practice 6 maps. No, you have to become as good as the top 10 teams in the world on 6 maps. That's a bit of a different task there. Any idiot can sit down and practice 5 or 6 maps. Can you become top 10 in the world on 6 maps? Because by definition, only 10 teams can. So if you see that premise, having a lot of maps and the system like where it's basically pre-decided does put extra strain on the teams, right?
Yeah, but there's not another good way to do it. So in this sort of best of 4 format where we're playing each game mode, like, you have to have an alternate. So you have to create some level of variance, because if we just were playing the same 5 maps every single time throughout an entire stage, it would get really old really fast for viewers. So you have to have at least one alternate. So that's why we have like we have 3 control maps because we have a tiebreaker, but only 2 in the first one, right? And so you're only dealing with really like a couple of different options for every single map type. So at least there's some level of variance, and it does stay that way for the whole stage. I honestly don't think that's going to have any change at all, because the only other option is like you play the same map pool every single match for an entire stage. So I don't anticipate that changing. That's something the pro players are just going to have to get used to.
So empirically, actually, I don't think that's supported when we still were playing, best of 5s where people could play maps. It was actually quite some variety. Almost, I mean, it is also a pretty big tool for especially underdog teams to pick specific maps. And I don't think that would necessarily happen. Maybe with some maps.
That actually becomes in other sports sometimes how, like for example, in Counter-Strike, you will occasionally get a team who are like let's say they're the 11th best team, but because they're good on a map that most teams don't like, they just tunnel on that and they make that's their way to win a game potentially.
Which is why I think the best mechanism here is loser selects next match, like they're doing in World Cup. So instead of us having a map pool the pool is always going to be there. There's always going to be at least 2 options, I think, for every map type. So you have, you'll pick between Volskaya and Hanamura, which instead of it before this season, or before the stage, it was like, you are playing this opponent on Volskaya. You don't have a choice. And that sucks, because if you're playing Boston on Volskaya that week and they're super good, even if you lose that first game, you're like, well, shit, we're going to Volskaya where we're just going to get pounded, right? Instead of being able to choose Hanamura or something away from Boston. So and also this will create closer, more exciting matches in general. And it'll create more definitive wins as well. Because if you're 4-0ing somebody and they're picking 3 of those, or even all 4 of those maps, that's like a big statement right there, that you're just basically just beating the crap out of them on their selections. So I think we should go back to loser selects, and you have a choice of every stage. The map pool is, we have these maps that are, you get a couple of decisions that you can make. There are 2 maps of every type in the pool, except for control, which is 3, because that's the tiebreaker for if we go to that 5th game. So you have these maps in the pool, you get to select if you lose. I think that is the way to solve this problem, rather than having a draft before every game, rather than having every map in the pool. There's a narrowed down pool like we had, and then there is a moment-to-moment selection.
I also don't know if in Overwatch actually there is boredom coming directly from playing the same map over and over, because unlike in other FPS, the heart of the content, or what people perceive to be very important to them, is actually not really map variety as much as it is champion variety. Yes. Now, this obviously, like there would be some other levers you could pull here, for instance, champion bans. I'm not too big of a fan of that one personally, but
nor am I.
That certainly would also mess with comps, right? But yeah, I don't know if necessarily that is an issue, and it will also raise the quality of matches generally if teams can just cut down on these specific differences, because currently, like, only really in specific matches, and not in many, but then in playoffs did we see really refined strategies towards map components and towards map structure. It's more like it felt like over the season teams only had like modularized ideas of, okay, this map has a lot of high ground, that means we're playing a lot of Widow or something. And then they ported these ideas onto specific maps because they couldn't get down to the specifics more than that. There was simply not enough time to calculate that. And then also, there's also something to be said about the fairness of it all, right? So if you have, even if you play every map the same amount of times against the same team, with the wildly different patches and the importance of certain heroes to teams, and by the way, like you can't expect every pro player to catch up. For instance, if Widow wasn't meta and suddenly it becomes meta in stage 2 and you have built your team around not having a Widow, you can't expect your DPS player to suddenly be Carpe. It just doesn't work that way. No amount of practice will help him that way. So if you build the talent based on these assumptions, that's already pretty problematic. But anyway, like that then creates that for instance, theoretically, you could have maps where Junkrat is very good in stage 1, and you could have a lot of them, right? And then you could, because how Junkrat changed, the complete map pool changes, and suddenly you can continue playing Junkrat on other maps. And artificially, your Junkrat player is boosted by random happenstance. And that, to a degree, I think actually happened to Houston.
Yeah. I mean, it does. I think it's unavoidable because, like you're saying, the greatest predictor of different heroes being used is different composition, or is different maps, right? So sure. I think that did change towards the end of the season because really the addition of Brigitte changed so much about the game, and it did force teams to like run a bunch of different compositions on maps in situations that they wouldn't have previously. So I think part of that is balance, where you need to have certain counters in the game so that you have better diversity of compositions on the same maps. And better like ideas of how to switch, because that's a fundamental core of Overwatch is you need to switch compositions. It's a mechanic that is unique and interesting to Overwatch because you can't switch in MOBAs. You can't change your heroes in the middle of the game. So this is something that needs to be pushed by Blizzard because that's very exciting. It's like one of my favorite, if not my favorite part of watching Overwatch is seeing these teams adapt on the fly. And that wasn't really happening earlier. Part of that was maps, part of that was hero balance, and we're seeing it more. And also part of it was inexperience. You know, we can talk about these professional games, but this is still the first season, and these players are still learning how to play the game. It's not like we've hit peak Overwatch yet. We probably won't even next year. Maybe the year after that, we'll start to like see some really sick stuff. But that's been my experience with esports in general. Is it takes a few years for even the pro players to really start to master the game.
Yeah. One other thing
about the maps, just in general about the maps, I think loser selects should be the next like big change that they make. I think that they're already doing things like the addition of Brigitte to bring the game into more of an interesting state in terms of hero diversity.
One other thing I thought was worth talking about, because it technically, I mean, it's technically tangential, but it is included in the format, is the fact that obviously in Overwatch, this is one of the things, by the way, that because people in Overwatch just accept this as the premise, having all the different game modes, people are that's just the world they live in. They just assume, well, it has to be that way. Of course we play all the game modes. It's like, that is probably the hardest thing to translate to people who are casuals from the rest of esports who watch an Overwatch game. Because, for example, if I show them certain modes, they can get into it. They can understand the concept. Obviously, for example, like the payload maps are a very simple concept that you can take someone who's an NFL fan and say, instead of the ball, watch the payload, try and figure out who's doing what, how they're going to move that forwards, how they're going to defend it. It's very simple to like conceptualize the game there. But some of the game modes in Overwatch are not only like not very good for even the players, but don't even seem to be that great a viewing experience. And then if you add that in, then now you have to practice all the game modes as well, or you have to decide which you're going to put more emphasis on. And then there's obviously how many of them have how many maps in the pool, and which maps are we good on. Then that also plays into the composition aspect. So I do feel as though the reason why I think that's a flaw is because there's one other esport I'm aware of that had the same flaw, which is Call of Duty. So in Call of Duty, they did the same thing. They had all these different game modes. And famously, the worst one was they had this one. I can't even remember what the name of it was. Maybe, was it Gridiron? It was the one where, even though Call of Duty is an FPS, so for example, search and destroy mode in Call of Duty is basically Counter-Strike. You have two teams, you try and kill each other. Everyone can understand that one. But there was this one mode they had where you actually had to get to a spot and throw a ball into a hole, like a basketball style.
Oh god, that was a terrible mode.
And this was a real mode that they were playing competitively. So, you know, that was part of whether you won the big championship, was like, you had to play that mode as well. So in that mode, it wasn't about whether you had like the sickest sniper or the best like ability to hold a spot or whatever. And so the point was, the pro players hated it. People watching it were like, what even is this? And it never made sense as to why it was in the pool. So that's something I want to ask you, Monty. Why did they include all the modes?
Because I think they don't want a mode to not be represented. So they've decided that these are the maps that they've got for the competitive ladder, and they want everybody to see every one. You know, they just want to see the range of modes available. Until they put other or remove things from the competitive mode or add new games to competitive mode, I don't think they're going to change that at all.
I mean, at some point, like if they keep producing maps at that pace. At some point, we hit the spot where it's basically impossible to play up without bans. And then also, I mean, it's then easy to justify just getting rid of one, right? Because if you have 20 maps and you through some metrics find out that one game mode is objectively the worst received and also produce the worst matches, why not? Why not make it like outsource that then also in competitive, by the way? I would definitely make it so that Overwatch League doesn't exclude a game mode and then makes it so that the competitive lifestyle has to play it. I definitely wouldn't advise for that, but why not?
Because, you know, that's one of the aspects, like, as I say, was so hard to translate to fans. Because, for example, if I had someone who was a friend of mine who watches Counter-Strike and he started watching a series, like, they would be like, oh, they're behind a map, a game rather. Can they come back? And I was like, well, they're not going to actually, because the next mode's like one that team's not very good at, and the map's actually one that the other team's the favorite on. He's like, all right. It's like, you know, like it seemed like it was hype. Like, well, they're down one game. Can they come back? It's like, no. Like, I hate to tell you this, but there's external factors mean it won't happen, I'm afraid. Like, you're thinking it's the same game. Oh, it was so close last game, though. They could do it. It's like, that. It's not the same game, though, which is why it's weird, because that is such a different aspect from any sport I'm aware of, you know. Like, you'd never have it like, right, they were doing really well in that quarter that was like just normal American football, but what will they do in the bonus round? Like, you know, there's nothing like that exists that you can really compare it to.
And personally, Control stands out to me as that game mode that I would personally get rid of.
It's the worst, for sure.
It's the worst, and it's also, sadly, the most meaningful if you think about it, simply because it's part of the best of four, if you were. For set, and
it's
then
the
also
tiebreaker.
By the way, I don't even think we need these as much anymore. How many maps are actually drawn? Like, I think Blizzard did a pretty good job in finding out, like, how to balance certain maps where ties actually don't happen that often anymore. Like, it's probably not over 10% of the maps, right? So, is that really an issue? Do we really need that then?
Yeah, I mean, you always are going to need it in a playoff situation, right? So it's, you know, we don't have that many draws anymore. It's true,
I think you've inadvertently brought up a point that we should do. We'll do this as the last point. Isn't that an issue with the league, that you can have draws? Now, I'm obviously not going to like go into a whole thing about Riot Games' infamous comment that Europeans love draws, which is probably what's great. That was it, ties. What was great about that was it was unintentionally the best like meme of all time, because it never even had lifespan as an actual point. It just instantly became a meme the second it came out of that guy's mouth. Like, now obviously no one likes ties. They're not good. Like, if there was an easy way in football to definitely ensure you could, they probably would have implemented it years ago. It's just that if you notice in football, famously penalty shootouts aren't very good. So you do save that for like a playoff scenario or a World Cup, because you have to decide the game. But they're actually a very well, the best way to describe it in football is the reason why you have ties in that game is because it's not satisfying to win or lose with the penalty shootout. It's like a worst case scenario. So is there a way that they could eliminate having ties entirely, Monty? Has anyone ever figured out a good system? Was there any good suggestions anyone had?
Like, we don't really get ties in terms of matches because we have the tiebreaker. So
on the maps, I mean,
even if you are to on the maps, I mean, yeah, they just rebalance the games. The nice thing about Overwatch is that the devs have access to like millions of games on these maps, so they can pretty accurately see where, you know, if an attacking team is winning 57% of the time, then that's like a problem, and then they'll make adjustments to the maps. And we do very rarely have map draws at this point, but I don't really see it as too big of an issue, because when a map draws, it's usually very close. And you have to think too that, you know, most of these maps are drawing when it's like 3-3 or like 4-4, you know, in Assault or something like that. So there's been usually a very high, like fast-paced match before that. It's rare for a draw to be boring.
Yes.
It's not like, you know, two teams just hold perfectly and then it's 0-0.
Yeah, it's like two full holds on like Assault. Like, that doesn't happen. It's much more likely that you have something where both teams complete a hybrid map and then get full held the second time around. So they're like fighting for that first tick, and it's like a 3-3 draw or something like that. So it's hard. First off, it's hard for there to be draws, and the devs are getting much better about tweaking the maps for that not to happen. And second off, draws themselves, I don't feel, maybe other people disagree, but I don't feel when I watch a draw in an Overwatch match like I've been robbed.
No.
I'm like, oh no, we'll just move on to the next one and then we'll see how that goes. Like usually they're very exciting.
Unlike every combat sport ever, where even if it's the best fight ever, if it's a draw, you literally just want like your money back that moment.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that it was a sick fight.
The difference is that with these draws, there's always something else that happens after them. It's not like in a combat sport where it's like draw, it's over. In Overwatch, it's draw. Here's another map. You decide it, right?
Okay.
Or draw. This team won at the end. You know, that's very rare. And also, I think that we set up the map. We set up the map order so that we can't end in a map that could draw.
Yes.
True.
Like we end in escort or control.
Yes.
So it's impossible for us to end with a draw.
Yeah. By the way, to me, the comparison between penalties and control is quite apt.
Yes. Agreed.
Like control is to Overwatch what penalties are to football, because penalties aren't actually football, if we're being honest. Like it's really just exacerbated one part of it. It's like one against a goalkeeper is shooting, and that is really only a fraction of what football is. And that very much feels the case for control as well. Because, for instance, one of the aspects that's still not solved is the first fight is immensely important, right? So inherently, it's like, that's actually the best part that fans don't know this. But it's like 66% of the time, if your team won the first fight, you win the map. Like if I already have that stance, knowing the outcome of the first fight, especially if it's a big one, if it's just a blowout and everyone has ults, and now we're talking 75%, how is that exciting for the rest of the map? It simply isn't, right?
Well, this is why I don't want to, like, I'm with you. I don't want to see control. It's also so different from every other map type. Every other map, assault, escort, and hybrid in Overwatch rewards a sort of set play. You have an approach. You know, you have a strategy that you're going in with, and control is much more chaotic, and it's sort of just like a brawl on the point, and it's not that interesting. And especially after this weekend's All-Stars game, when we actually got to see the pro teams play 6v6 lockout, which is the game mode I would really like to see replace control or something similar. The pro players were actually surprisingly good at staying alive in 6v6 lockout. So I know from a production end, the production didn't expect that match type to go that long because, of course, in lockout, once you're dead, you're dead. But those teams were actually shockingly good at like keeping themselves up and running strategies on those maps and picking out compositions. And I think it could get even better over time. So,
or just random heroes and they could go in and. We revived the what the fuck 2 shells meme. What the fuck 2 hours?
No mystery heroes, please. I had to cast that. It was fun, but it was also a disaster in terms of actual strategic value.
Yeah.
This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Daniel Yordanov, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, Kyla Harris, James Harding, Caesar, and special thanks go out to Matt Shakowski and Jerky's Minion in particular. Want teasers for my upcoming content? How about asking me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? How about suggesting a topic or a guest for my content? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today.